Hi, I wanted to do a video about drip irrigation and some of my challenges I had and some of the things I learned from YouTube and from the internet and from doing it myself. So here's some of my parts over here, and I wanted to kind of go through why I decided what I'm using and what some of the different parts are. So your first thing you need to figure out if you want to use PVC or polyethylene. Polyethylene is also called poly. And I think the determination is made based on what's popular in my area, wherever you are in the country. I think different parts of the country have it popular, either one or the other method. PVC is a solid white pipe, and I think I use paint to put it together. I use polyethylene, also known as poly. And so just to give you a little heads up, um, what I have here is these. I have two piles here. This here is a pile of poly. I've got two different sizes. I've got 3/4 and I got a 1/2 inch. And then I'll get to the other part here in a minute. The second decision you need to make is if you want to use barbed connections or compression fittings or permalock. Barb fittings, they fit together really well, but it deforms the poly a bit, which is not the best thing. Compression fittings are good also, and I believe they're pretty seal proof, but you can't take them apart. They're not replaceable. So if you have compression fittings, you want to change your layout, you need to cut those compression fittings out and use the poly as it is. The third choice is permalock, and that's a bit more expensive, I guess, but it's you can change it out, you can move things around, it's a little more flexible, and based on my research, it seemed like the more superior choice, and that's what I went with. Here's a few permalock fittings here. You got your standard fittings. Here's an elbow over here, here's a T over here, standard plumbing kind of stuff. And what you do is you would take the poly and you would shove it into here, and then you would hand tighten it, and that should be good enough. There's a few other fittings I have over here, but it's got the standard kind of fittings, and it's kind of fun setting it all up because you kind of make a plan, or I guess you can hire somebody, and then from there you figure out how much of this you need, how much of that you need, and you can get really creative. Of course, the best solution probably is the simple solution, but it could take a while to figure out what the best solution is based on your environment. The third question, if you decide on poly, is whether you want to use drip line or emitters. I went with drip line. So this here is poly or polyethylene, and over here is drip line, which looks pretty much the same, although the one difference here is every 18 inches there's a hole. So that's where the water comes out. Whereas this one, the poly, has no holes. So this brings it from the faucet over to where you want to emit the water, and I have the poly line, the drip line, spitting the water out at about every 18 inches. So that's part of the plan. You have your poly set up to bring the water to where you want to distribute it, and while it's going through the path, you don't want to spit out the water. And then when you want to spit it out, then you have this line set up. So that's the setup I went with. The alternative to this is using emitters, and the way emitters work is you would poke a hole a little with a little gizmo with your hand, a little hole, then you would shove the thing in there, and it's a different kind of setup. I didn't like that as much. Based on my research, it seems like it clogs up more, which I didn't want to go with. Notice I used two different sizes over here. They look pretty similar, but trust me, they're different sizes. There is this 3/4 inch, and this over here is 1/2 inch, which is a bit thinner. And I used 3/4 inch off the hose, and then over towards the where I'm using the stuff, I use the 1/2 inch. And the reason I use the two different sizes is the different sizes have their pros and cons. The 3/4 inch can hold more water, there's less friction, so it's really good to go from the faucet out to where you want to distribute the water, and then the 1/2 inch is a better choice when you're kind of more local, where you're at the point where you actually want to distribute the water out. The general rule of thumb is, as I said, the fatter the the poly, the fatter the any of the tubes, there's less friction, which can be a challenge if you want to bring the water a far distance. It can carry more water. Those are both positives. It does cost a bit more for the bit wider. It's not as flexible. So there's pros and cons. The general rule of thumb is if you got 1 inch, which is used for commercial, you could bring the water a long distance. If you use 3/4 inch, you can bring the water from the source, from the faucet, whatever, 480 feet, or else you can carry 480 gallons per minute. And it's kind of the same for a 1/2 inch. It's 200. So it's either 200 feet you can carry it, or about 200 gallons per minute you can carry. And then when you drop down to 1/4 inch, you can only carry about water about 30 feet, or about 30 gallons. So the way that would work is on my setup over here, I've got the faucet, the starting point, and I bring along the 3/4 inch line. So 3/4 inch line, I can go 480 feet and also carry 480 gallons per minute, which some interesting calculations here. So from here to the very end is 480. And then when I bring it along over about here, I switch over to 1/2 inch. So from this point going forward, it can only go about 200 feet further. And actually my setup, I didn't use 1/4 inch tubing at all. That's also known as spaghetti tubing. I didn't use that at all. So that's part of the design, to figure out how to get to all your different parts. And then of course when you're using different parts, this right here is a T, and that's going from 1/2 inch all over. So that would be a 1/2 inch T all the way around. At some point I have T's where they transition from 3/4 inch to 1/2 inch, and I need to take that into account to get the appropriate T, or else things won't fit together. It's a bit weird because the sizes are called 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch, an inch and 1/4, but that's not the inner diameter or the outer diameter. I got my parts through dripdepot.com, and I was a little confused by their setup. I was like, none of your parts have that number. None of them have 1/2 inch, or 1/2 inch doesn't have 1/2 inch for the outer diameter, inner diameter, and the parts that put them together, they don't have that as their dimensional size either. So these things gonna fit, and they said as long as you get it from us, it'll work. And I do recommend Drip Depot for getting your things, or some other website. I don't recommend the kits. Based on my experience, looking online, it looked like kits. You kind of get junk product. This stuff is kind of costly, and it requires a little bit of knowledge. And just getting a kit doesn't seem like your best bet because they just kind of put junk in there. Another challenge is compatibility. Drip Depot said you can trust our items if you get it from us, but I wouldn't trust it if you got a mix of some of our parts and some of a competitor's website. I'm not sure if that's a protective kind of measure or if that's if they were legit. But I trusted them and everything worked out. As long as I got my parts all from them, everything did work out. So that is my setup. I've got 3/4 inch coming off the hose, and then I used 1/2 inch. I used no 1/4 inch at all. So everything I got is poly out to my line, and then I got the drip line going to feed the plants. Some things I found out from my research is that the black line lasts longer. There's an alternative to use brown line. I'm talking about the color, and black. Based on my research, I think it might have been just one YouTube video. The guy said that black lasts longer. I'm not sure if that's true. And there's positives about more gallons per minute, that it clogs less, and that's why I went with a 1/2 inch distribution line out here, 1/2 inch emitter line, because I found, based on my research, it seemed like 1/2 inch would clog less than the 1/4 inch, so that's why I went that route. And another thing about my holes, I don't know if I've set it up perfectly, but I'm planning to have the holes along here to be at the top of the line. So like for instance, that one I did correctly. Maybe not all of them I did correctly, but they all should be at the top. And the way it works, if it's at the top, then it won't clog as much. It'll spit the water, same amount of water is coming out, but it will spit it outward and not be covered with dirt. Another challenge I haven't quite figured out what I should do is, I did cover my poly lines just because I don't want to step on them, There's no holes in them. There's nothing really complicated. So I covered them with 6 inches, which is the recommended level. But these, I didn't bother covering. But now I'm thinking, I'm not sure if I should cover these with mulch. I'm not going to cover them with dirt or compost, but put them above the dirt and compost and maybe cover them with a mulch. And that way they'll be protected from the sun and getting worn out by the sun. And the water will stay down near the root line instead of watering the mulch. The challenge is I don't want things to get clogged, so I'm not sure the best situation there. So I'm going to do some more research, but I think I'm planning to cover with mulch at some point down the road. So the first steps, I think, the best idea would be to map out your area. So what I mean by map out your area is where you want to water stuff. So here I want to water this area, and I water actually this area. And then I've got the 2 beds over here I want to water. So the first step is to figure out what you want to water. And then the second step, which can be a little challenging, is to figure out how you want to route your pipes. So yeah, I have over here, these 2 beds over here. And based on my knowledge, I got a splitter over here. So one goes over to here, one goes over to here. And going back to the faucet, I have this area here. I have these 2 coming off and feeding that area, and then I have this area over here, and so I have this line over here going over to that area, and then I have it going back over to the faucet. And so I figured out my dimensions. I figured out how much pipe I need to get over to the area, and then I also did my calculations. So I did mention some numbers earlier. 3/4 inch can handle bringing the water 480 feet. It can also handle 480 gallons per minute. I have no problem with 480 feet. My system is not going that far out from the source, so that wasn't a problem. But in terms of the gallons per minute, I used the 480 or the 200 gallons per minute per hour for the 1/2 inch. I kind of use those numbers as my guide for whether I should use 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch for my application. So what I mean by that is, coming off the faucet here, if you follow this along, I need a full 480. All the way out to here, and then over to here. And this area over here, I use the emitter line, like I said, and the emitter line, I have holes at every 18 inches, every 1.5 foot of line. And I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines here. Each line's about 15 feet. And so this only needs about, if I could do the math here, 15 feet times 5 divided by 1.5, about 50 gallons per hour. And so I'm fine with a 1/2 inch line to feed this area. So I only use the 1/2 inch line to feed this area. I don't really need that much. And the same over here. These 2 beds, I cut it down to about 1/2 inch getting over to here because I didn't need the full 3/4. And it's a little cheaper and easier to use a smaller size, and it's a little more maneuverable when you get to those tight areas. And maybe I'll be moving these lines around, so I figured 1/2 inch works fine. So there is a little bit of plan in there, kind of those 2 steps. First, figure out where you want to put it, and then the second one to figure out how you want to lay your lines out so everything kind of meets up. So after you figure that out, you want to double check your numbers and maybe see for some expansions in your area maybe in the future, in case you're thinking, over here I kind of hit a fence over there, or maybe I go further. If I go further, maybe I would be planning to if I was going to go a lot further, maybe I'd plan for maybe a bigger size to feed a bigger area. I'm not sure, but I don't think I'm going to go any further. That's the fence there. That's kind of the end of it. And then once you figured out what you want, you double checked it. You maybe check with a website or an expert, or check with somebody who's going to install it. You order it, and after that's done, you get all the parts and you install. And actually, I got lucky. I ordered about what I needed, a little more than I needed, and everything worked out right, and everything got put together. The compatibility, like I said, is a challenge. So I did go through Drip Depot. That was a really good website, and they were really helpful over there. And you gotta, know your stuff. You gotta use some you have your knowledge. This is a T. This is going from half inch to half inch. You got your elbows. Let me see if I can see my parts here. You got your elbows like this. If you got a sharp turn like that, the poly is a little flexible, so maybe you don't need too many elbows. If your material is, you can maneuver it a bit. When it's hot out and the sun's out, the sun will help you out. It'll help make the material a little more pliable, a little more easy to play with, a little more movable while it's soft or when the hot sun's out there. At the end of each line, so right here I've got my emitter line, and at the end of each line, you would put an end point. If you don't put an end point, the water would just come roaring out of there. So you take one of these end caps and you put it in there and you tighten it up. And so it looks like that with the end out. This is what it looks like with the end in. And another way of doing the end of the line is to use a figure eight. So you take the figure eight, put the one side in over the half inch, and then you put it on the other end. So it looks like a figure eight. So let me show you one of those figure eight setups. Because I use both of these kind of ends. Because here I am thinking about expanding. So I use the figure eight. My thinking is I'll use a figure eight. You get it on the one side pretty easy, and the other side you got to bend it. But that'll be an effective end of the line. And the reason why I use that figure eight is because I'm going to expand this area down the road, I think, and bring it all the way to the fence. But for now, for this year, that seems like a pretty good fix. So the plan would be down the road to take that figure eight out, to stretch the line out to the end, and put one of those other alternative end caps at the very end when it's all done. So talking about some of the parts, I did say not to use kits. I think the one exception is I do recommend there's kind of two parts here. Here's my hose, my faucet, and we got the timer, and the rest of this stuff is called the head assembly. So I do recommend getting a head assembly kit. And there's a few things that this thing does. I won't go through it too much, but there's a filter, there's a thing that reduces the pressure, and they tighten on like hose parts. There's another piece on there that prevents backflow, which I guess that's a challenge. You don't want your backflow to end up from the irrigation system back in the house. I'm not sure how much of a challenge that is. And your very last part is a transition. So you need to know if you're going to be using 3/4 inch line or half inch line or full inch, depending on the size of your system or how much robustness you want to build in there. Everything just screws in like a regular hose part. I was a little confused on mine. I got my timer here as the first part because that's the way Drip Depot recommends, and the timers are pretty easy to use. I got the timer set to come on every day for an hour or so. Maybe I will adjust that. But each part you just kind of screw into there, based on the schematic given by Drip Depot or whatever website. The one challenge is my timer here has multiple zones. Well, actually mine just has one zone, and that works out fine. But Drip Depot seemed to say that's the setup. You used to put the timer first. But if there's multiple zones, it seems like kind of a hassle to get multiple of these items and have each of these items for each of the zones. Because I would think it would make a lot more sense, if you had a zone kind of timer, to have all the head assembly, all these parts here at the very beginning, and then have the timer at the very end, and then use the timer as the last part, and then have the one hose coming off the timer for each zone. But that wasn't a problem for me, so I wasn't really concerned. So you have that, and then you have some of the parts I showed earlier. There's this is my poly going along over here, and then it comes along underneath here, underneath the dirt. And then I've got that's kind of interesting. I've got one of my shut-off valves here, so that I could shut off the area over here temporarily or long term if I don't want to feed this area at all. Shut off that area and the water could keep going to the other areas. Over here, and the one thing that's kind of tricky, I do feed from here, from the poly, over to my emitter line over here, But because I want to keep 3/4 inch the whole main line, I do have T's here. And you'll see a detail, the dirt on top, but it's 3/4 inch on the main line, and the T transitions from 3/4 and that one sticking out at the end here, that is 1/2 inch. And so you got to make sure you plan those kind of things. You don't want to have this 1/2 inch to 1/2 inch, or else it won't fit on the line. And you don't want to transition this to 1/2 inch either, because it will kind of choke the system. Once you put a choke point there, the water will have a tough time perhaps fitting through the line if you have a lot of stuff down the line. Because once you have a lower size pipe, everything down the line will kind of be affected by that. So I made sure to have 3/4 inch the whole way along. So that's kind of a lot of my setup. So at the end of the year, the plan is, according to online, which makes sense, is everything over here, the timer, the head assembly, to take that all inside, and to take my air compressor and plug it onto here. And part of the head assembly setup is, these lines here, open these up, open all these endpoints on, because every single one of my lines ends with an endpoint. I've got the holes at every 18 inches to let the water out, and then here at the endpoint I have these gizmos so the water stops. But at the end of the year, I'll open these up and let it free, and then put an air compressor on, and then force the air out. So that looks like everything I kind of planned out.